Welcome to PAB 2010.
Contracts are basically simple agreements. This is the first thing they teach you in law school. Anytime you see an agreement that anybody has, whether it's written or whether it's just, Connie and me being friends or anything else, there's an element of an agreement there. There's an exchange. I'm going to be friendly with her. I won't slam her to people behind her back, and I hope that she reciprocates and does the same. So most enforceable contracts have something that's an exchange of value, which is consideration, which I always thought was interesting because consideration in everyday language means that you actually feel for somebody and actually think about something before you do it. And then we've got the social contracts. A lot of the time, sometimes they're explicit, like you hold the door open for the person behind you. That's pretty tacit most of the time. Not everybody does it, but it used to be explicit, and the rules, I think, are changing more and more all the time. Why is any of this important? All of this stuff is rules of the relationship road. And when we're building relationships in person, if we're building relationships with our audience, you kind of need to have a sense of the rules of the road. Rented lips behind on payments. Everyday social contracts. We've got the Big 10, which are, the classic 10 commandments. We've got marriage and divorce, which I always say, whenever I'm having an argument with my husband, it's time to renegotiate the terms of the contract when I want him to do more of the dishes and he chooses not to. If you break that contract, we all know what that is, divorce, and that's yet another agreement. Friendships are an agreement. Again, I think sometimes we know exactly what to do and sometimes we don't. When I found out Andrea was sick, one of the most frustrating things for me is being in the States. I can't go over and wash her kids or cook her dinner or anything, so the best I could do was knit her some weird faux hair and hats and stuff, to feel like I was actually doing something to keep up my end of the bargain, really. And then there's financial contracts. Every time you buy something, that's clearly one. We agree that we're all supposed to pay our debts and be good citizens and have good manners and everything else. The golden rule, of course, is do unto others before they would do unto you. But we're breaking a lot of these traditional agreements these days. Yes, I'm a secular person, so forgive me for picking on the church, but the church certainly does not have a good track record right now in terms of living up to everything that it has promised. But likewise with the banks and the mortgage crisis, you find very much the same sort of thing. A lot of people are walking away from their houses and their properties and their obligations because they feel like they can do that. Their house, instead of being a home and a hearth and everything that's very meaningful, is becoming a financial transaction because that's how everybody's dealing with it. And, when you see some people becoming enriched while other people are not, when they're, if you're paying your bills and somebody else is getting a huge bonus for no apparent reason, you can really feel that there's a betrayal of that fundamental trust. And when you've got that, then there's no reason for you to honor your obligation back. And in fact, Dan Ariely has a brand new book out about the upside of irrationality, and one of the things he talks about is if you feel somebody's done you wrong, the first reaction actually is sort of a sense of vengeance. You really want to get even. So it's like somebody does something really nasty to you and you're like, God, I'd love to go key their car. Sometimes there's a barrier that's, ooh, I might get caught, or some other moral thing that you've ingested that will keep you from doing that. But sometimes we just sit there and we break that rule and go, who cares? But that's all whether or not you decide to break that contract of what's appropriate and what's not. So why is a lot of this stuff seeming to happen? I think there's a lot of expectations that are getting violated a lot of the time, and it's disrupting these sort of rules. For podcasters and for people producing new media, what are the expectations you have for yourself in your podcast, for your blog? What, again, very much like Michael was saying earlier and other people have said, what is your purpose or your mission and what are you doing? What are your expectations from your audience? I know a lot of people don't necessarily get the comments or the feedback or anything they want. It's strange. In some ways, I haven't been actively producing the LD podcast for a long time, and I'm getting more comments and stuff back now. I know part of that is because more and more people are actually consuming media and podcasts, and more people are adopting on the curve. So if I'm not actively producing and people are going back and listening to content, that's actually great for me because it means that the shows that I designed beforehand are still relevant to them, and they can pop on anytime they want. But did I stop doing the show actively because of something for me or because I didn't feel I had that audience, or what was my obligation and my contract to that audience that I started to build in the first place? Am I looking for contacts or interaction? Is it we have a lot of passive consumption that goes on. I think I took the kids to see Hair on Broadway, which was sort of a mixed thing anyway, because it does have a lot of naked people, and you've got your 12-year-old sitting there and going like, really, why did they take off all their clothes in the middle? Which is interesting. We also had that conversation when they were listening to NPR and the Elliot Spitzer stuff came on, and he asked why somebody would pay $5,000 to see somebody in their hotel room, and I had to say, well, I think she was naked, and he's like, why would you possibly pay $5,000 to have a naked woman in your room? And I'm like, you'll understand when you get older, dear. That's what puberty is all about. So anyway, so one of the things Michael Jordan said is you have to expect great things from yourself before you can actually do them. There's a lot of societal expectations that are sort of tacit, right? You're going to go to school, you're going to get a job, you're going to get married, create more taxpayers, because that's good for the government. You're going to live a little and then die, and then, you know, your kids get to wash, rinse, and repeat. Are we making our needs clear? Are we asking for what we want? And are we expecting people to already know what to do? Again, when we went and saw Hair, the fact that the actors were really coming into the audience and stuff was really freaking a lot of people out. And part of it is it's breaking that third wall between us and our audience. And I think people coming in now don't necessarily know that as podcasters, we're looking for a lot of that interaction. They still assume that we're traditional media. They don't see a difference between us and NPR and Ira Glass and everything else, even though we do. So there's two approaches here. You can take the Dalai Lama's approach, which is to have no expectations whatsoever and not be hindered by them, or assuming that you're not going to succeed unless you have really wild and outrageous dreams that you've got something big to shoot for. You know, again, for social media expectations, it's, are you going to follow? Is your reputation really what you say it is, or is it what Google says it is? Are you being clear about this stuff? And what happens when our expectations get violated? The tsunami of disappointment. But it's all about, ultimately, with this contract, it's getting our expectations and needs met. Justin Kownacki said recently, in our rush to monetize social media, we forgot to create experiences that people want. So you have to ask, are you creating value with what you're doing? Is it valuable to you? Is it valuable to somebody else? And how are you going to go ahead and measure it? Because we love our own stuff. We love it to death. There's the boyfriend sweater problem. Anybody who's ever knit anything, it takes forever, and it's about $100 or more to get the yarn, to knit a sweater for somebody. If it takes a year and you give it to them and they hate it, you want to kill them. This has destroyed more relationships, I can tell you. This is why if you are somebody and you're knitting for somebody else, start out with like socks or mittens or something. But with the podcast too, are you creating something that's really for you and that you love it, or are you creating it for your audience? But the one thing that I realized this past year beyond anything else is that there are very few opportunities for you to get external validation once you're an adult. The feeling has to come from inside again. And you know, so I have done 2 half marathons so far this past year. One of them was the Princess Half Marathon, and my husband's very fond of saying there's nothing more frightening than 13,000 women in tiaras. And he's actually right about that, but, you know, particularly at 4 in the morning at Disney World. But, you know, again, the nice thing about a half marathon, at least, is if you're looking for external validation, you get across that finish line, they hand you a medal. That's the, you know, you don't get that very often as an adult because all your competition tends to be internal, or it tends to be something your boss sets up against the person sitting next to you or whatever. But there's very few times when you get somebody handing something and go, you did a great job. So anyway, in order to move forward, you need to set reasonable goals and celebrate your successes. Have those little things that are those benefits at the end. Even if it's just going out for ice cream at the end of the week, keep you going. Live up to your end of the bargain from whatever expectations you have with your audience. Make sure there's that sort of exchange so you're meeting the expectations. I think, you know, again, Andrea talked about earlier about finding out that people cared a lot more than she thought they did because they're a lovely but quiet audience, which most kind of book lovers and librarians are, but you never know unless you really hear from them. But we need to be able to ask for that and not take ourselves for granted. You know, make it easy for people to do the right thing and tell them what the right thing to do is. You know, adjust a little bit if you need to set your expectations a little higher, but don't make them so big that it feels like you're pushing that boulder up the hill all the time. You know, it's okay to be nice to yourself from time to time, and if you don't know where you're going, you know, any road will really get you there.